So hello everyone, my name is Koop Irwin. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Frost Brown Todd, and I'm pleased to talk with you and give this flash webinar on OSHA's new Vaccinate or Test Emergency Temporary Standard. So you may have heard, of course, in the news that OSHA issued its Vaccinate or Test Emergency Temporary Standard last week. There have already been legal challenges filed, and we'll talk about that more later. But first, again, what you have heard is that it's a Vaccinate or Test Emergency Temporary Standard requiring certain employers to either require its employees to be vaccinated, or if not vaccinated, then to have a weekly COVID test. So in the next 15 or 20 minutes, we're going to do a high-level, top-level review on the most pertinent questions that clients and employers like you all are asking. So first and foremost, who's covered by OSHA's ETS? Well, employers with 100 or more employees at any point on or after the effective date of the ETS are covered. The ETS attempts to eliminate potential employer efforts to exempt themselves by reducing the number of employees after the effective date. How do you calculate 100 or more employees? Well, it's company-wide. It's not at a particular site. So all employees working at different sites of a company are used to calculate that 100 number. A frequent question that we've been asked by clients is, what if I have different subsidiary companies? So different companies with different specific legal entities or FEINs. And the answer to that question can be found in the preamble of the ETS, and it states that 2 or more related entities may be counted as a single employer if they handle safety matters as one company. So that means, for example, if those related entities have one workers' compensation insurer, one workers' compensation policy that covers all of those employees. If they have one HR function and are subject to one employee handbook that delineates safety procedures. If you have common and shared safety managers, if you file OSHA reports under one company, all of those types of matters and how they're handled, if they're handled collectively, would make those separate legal entities considered to be one employer. Of course, there is no exception for employees that are covered by a collective bargaining agreement. So if you are an employer that has unionized employees, you are not accepted from this OSHA ETS. And we'll talk about your requirements to engage in what's called effects bargaining over some of these rules later. And when you're calculating those 100 or more employees, do part-time employees count? The answer is yes. Independent contractors do not. Now, what are the requirements of the ETS? Simply put, you can either require all of your employees to be vaccinated, or if you choose to issue a written policy, you have to issue a written policy. You can also have employees undergo weekly COVID-19 testing and wear a mask while at work. If you do not have a written policy, the default is that all employees must be vaccinated. Who must be vaccinated? Again, all employees, unless you have that written policy providing for weekly COVID testing. Who pays for the vaccine? At this point, the OSHA ETS says that employers are not required to pay for the vaccine, but there are more challenges regarding state laws. Many state laws actually implicate that an employer might have to pay for the vaccine because they prohibit employees from paying for healthcare required tests for work. So that's an open question that my colleagues and I will be digging into more in the coming days. Does it matter which vaccine an employee receives? Most vaccines that are on the market are covered and approved by the OSHA ETS, so whether it's J&J, Pfizer, or Moderna, there's not a requirement that employees receive one particular vaccine. Must an employee be compensated for the time spent getting the vaccine? The answer is yes. The time spent Traveling also to a vaccination site is covered, and the OSHA ETS provides for at least 4 hours of paid time off at an employee's regular rate to go and receive the vaccine. Now, must an employee be compensated for the time spent recovering from side effects of the vaccine? Also, the answer is yes. OSHA does not define how much time. It provides a reasonable time period for employees to recover from side effects of the vaccine. And in recently published FAQs earlier this week, OSHA mentions a reasonableness of 2 days. However, of course, it also acknowledges that certain side effects could last longer than 2 days. So they implicate or indicate that 2 days would be a reasonable time period, but don't set that forward as a total standard. Now, more questions. Must an employer pay for travel time to and from a vaccine appointment? Again, the answer is yes. What kind of proof of vaccine is required? Well, it can be in the form of a vaccination card. It can also be in the form of an attestation that their as to a vaccination status is acceptable from a healthcare provider, under language certifying the truth of their statement that would be subject to criminal penalties. It can also be additional healthcare records as well, or a copy of medical records, or some other official document that contains that information. Now, who can be exempted from vaccine requirements and for what reasons? Well, the ETS acknowledges, as well as EEO laws, acknowledge that employers must provide reasonable religious and disability accommodations for individuals who either may have sincerely held religious beliefs that conflict with a vaccine requirement or a disability that does not allow them to become vaccinated. The OSHA ETS also includes individuals who have medical conditions that would be contraindicated to receiving the vaccine. So that's something less than a disability, but a condition that would have contraindications in receiving the vaccine. Outside of those EEOC, or aside from those EEO, disability, religious, or contraindications, also employees who exclusively work outside are not required to be vaccinated or receive a weekly test. And the question is, what does the term exclusively working outside means? And that means truly exclusively working outside. And in fact, in the FAQs released by OSHA, again, earlier this week, that states that for construction sites in which they might be partially working outside that have walls or unfinished walls or ceilings, that would not qualify as exclusively working outside. Also, individuals, for example, who may work outside but who occasionally go into the office or occasionally go into a break room on a construction site would not be considered working exclusively outside. Additionally, individuals who may be traveling with a coworker in a vehicle to a work site would not be considered to be working exclusively outside. Individuals who work from home 100% and do not report to a work site would also be exempted from the requirement, or individuals who go to a work site but who are the only ones at that work site and do not interact with any other coworkers, even occasionally, would be exempted from these requirements. Now let's talk weekly testing. Who pays for the testing? Interesting question. Well, the OSHA ETS says that employers under the ETS are not required to pay for the testing, but also instruct employers to look to other state and federal wage and hour laws. And many wage and hour laws indicate that there might be an employer responsibility to pay for the time spent going to be tested if they're not vaccinated, getting a weekly COVID test, or the actual cost of the testing itself. In addition, for example, if an employee is making around minimum wage, if the cost of the test might bring them under the minimum wage, that could be a wage and hour violation. There are other state and federal laws that might require an employer to pay for the cost of that test. So again, that's an open question under the to be determined category. So what type of COVID test is acceptable? Well, acceptable COVID-19 tests are those approved by the Food and Drug Administration in an emergency use authorization that are administered in accordance with the authorized instruction and not self-administered and self-read unless observed by the employer or an authorized telehealth proctor. So examples of these tests include tests with specimens processed by a laboratory, proctored over-the-counter tests, point-of-care tests, and tests where specimen collection is either done or observed by the employer. So that means, for example, a COVID test that you could purchase at your local drugstore could technically be used so long as the test itself is observed by the employer and or an authorized telehealth proctor. What must an employer compensate an employee who can't come to work while waiting for a test result? OSHA does not require employers to compensate employees while they're at home not working, awaiting test results. So let's talk weekly testing. How frequently must the employee be tested? Those employees must be tested for COVID-19 within 7 days prior to returning to the workplace and provide documentation of that test result upon their return to work. So that's, again, every 7 days. If you have an employee who, for example, only occasionally reports to a work site, say once a month, that employee must still provide proof of a negative test 7 days prior to returning to the work site. So some pre-planning is certainly going to be required in that regard. What if an employee cannot access a test? For example, supply chain issues that we're hearing about in the news. OSHA does not exempt or provide exceptions where there are supply chain issues. And part of the reason I believe why that's the case is that they've expanded the form of the acceptable tests used for the purposes of this OSHA ETS. Now, will employees be subject to other social distancing and mask requirements, even though they test negative for COVID? Yes. So in addition to, if you're not vaccinated, if you are going to choose the vaccinate or weekly test route, employees who are not vaccinated and are undergoing weekly testing must wear a mask indoors. So what are the restrictions on masks and face coverings? In addition to requiring employees who are not vaccinated to wear masks at work, the ETS also restricts employers' ability to prevent employees from wearing masks. So whether or not employees vaccinated or not, employers must permit employees to wear masks or face coverings at work if they wish to do so. Can you terminate an employee who refuses to comply with these requirements? Yes, with the caveat that, of course, you must recognize your duty to make reasonable disability, religious accommodations, or exemptions for contraindications, as well as employers with unionized employees have to engage in effects bargaining. And one of the issues that unions are likely going to want to discuss during those bargaining sessions is the disciplinary process for employees who refuse to comply, whether or not it's refused to be vaccinated or failure to provide a negative COVID test when coming to work. So the legal challenges to the ETS, you may have heard on the news that just 24 hours after the final rule was published on Friday, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals granted an injunction on Saturday. Now, 25 state attorneys general filed that lawsuit seeking to ban enforcement. Other interested parties, including unions, business entities, and other government officials, have filed various challenges to the ETS across the country. And in fact, because those challenges are in different circuit courts of appeals, a lottery will be held next week to determine which appeals court will actually decide this issue. So once that lottery is determined and the appeals court is identified, whether or not it's considered to be a conservative court or a court friendly to the current Biden administration and the ETS, whatever the court hearing that appeal is, it will likely be decided before the new year. So whether or not the OSHA ETS is either invalidated or upheld, we're likely to know before the new year. So what does that mean for you? Is that these deadlines regarding compliance may, if it's upheld, require you to comply before the new year. And remember, the deadlines for the OSHA ETS are that 30 days after the publication, which would be December 5th, employers are required to implement all the requirements of the ETS except the weekly testing requirement. So if you're going to opt for a weekly testing requirement in lieu of vaccination, you would have to come into compliance with that weekly testing requirement within 60 days after publication, which would be January 4th of 2022. And that means that if a court would uphold the ETS between Christmas and New Year, for example, you would still likely need to comply with the vaccinate or test requirement by January 4th. So that's all to say, don't wait to prepare. These deadlines for compliance would still apply and likely not be delayed or pushed back just because of these legal challenges. So what can you do behind the scenes over the next few weeks while this is percolating through the courts? Well, first, you should count your employees to determine if you're covered by the ETS, to determine if you have 100 employees. And then you need to decide on your program. Are you going to require vaccines for all, or are you going to allow employees to opt out and do weekly testing? If you're going to decide and opt for a weekly testing program, you have to have a written policy. You will also need to develop a testing program and begin to gather documentation. Once you have that written policy, if you're an employer who has employees who are represented by a union, you should begin to and will need to engage in what's called effects bargaining. You have an obligation under the National Labor Relations Act to bargain with the union, even though there's a mandate in place on additional effects that are discretionary. So how to test, repercussions or disciplinary actions for employees who will not comply or may not comply with the requirements, as well as, for example, additional leave, paid leave requirements for employees who are testing, how the test will be paid for, are all likely to be issues that a union will want to discuss as a part of effects bargaining. And then, of course, wait for further guidance. The ETS was just published last Thursday and formally written into the Federal Register, or published in the Federal Register on Friday. And at the beginning of this week, OSHA rolled out new FAQs providing for additional guidance. There are, of course, a myriad of questions facing employers, like what wage and hour issues do we face? Can we discipline employees? Things of that nature. And we are looking for additional guidance and expect to receive additional guidance from both OSHA as well as the Department of Labor and the National Labor Relations Board. So with that, that's a top level review, quick, for the OSHA ETS. I thank you for your time. If you have any additional questions as you move through these issues in these very strange and interesting times, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is kirwin@fbtlaw, and my direct line is 412-513-4273. Happy to be of help.